Chapter 3.
There's only a few things a body needs to keep crumping legs. One is someone to crop. Second is fungus beer. Third is water. That's just biology.
Boss Doc Bigsaw. Orbit, second moon of Serenade. 3 days before tomb opening. The two ships hit the gravitational well with a slam of deceleration, hooking themselves into the moon's orbit and circling it in streaking paths as they bled momentum. To anyone watching, it appeared that Serenade's second moon had suddenly gained 2 white-hot rings. To any world unfortunate enough to experience a Necron invasion, it might seem as if the tomb fleet appeared from nowhere. Great crescent ships hanging above the curve of the globe, weapon systems already flaring with their opening fusillade, firefly swarms of ghost arcs descending to the target continent. Witnesses on the surface might see bursts of light, too bright to look upon, yet casting no shadow, before a metal death's head reared out of the wan gateway. They rarely saw beyond that. But what appeared instantaneous, coming without warning like an earthquake or solar flare, was in reality the result of long planning and close management. Mustering the Deathless Legions and charting a course for war was a multi-decade process, fraught with setbacks. This was particularly true when raising a legion from the Great Sleep. Fast deployment from cryostasis nearly always damaged neural circuitry, which was why any functioning world mind only roused its legions for self-defense. Even then, it usually deployed simple warriors first, those with little mind to ruin, rather than the more valuable immortals, Lichguard and Deathmarks. Trazyn and Orokin had no wish to permanently damage those they raised, particularly since an action of this size could not go unnoticed by the Awakened Council. Should vital assets of the Infinite Empire be wasted on a personal quest, even one semi-sanctioned by their body, it was no doubt the Executioner would come for them. After all, the Great Awakening was only millennia away, give or take a few centuries, and that effort required all the force their diminished empire could muster. Yet they hurried the process as much as possible. Neither Trazyn nor Orokin had been soldiers, though both had, at times, accompanied the legions. They therefore had no compunction, whether it be honour or superstition, about jettisoning the more time-consuming military rituals. There was time for nothing but to muster the Decurion and go. Serenade lacked a Dolmen Gate, or any webway portal. Whatever escape hatch the Exodites built to flee into the labyrinth dimension, they'd close behind them. Transporting a few small forces there was no trouble. Send a Night Scythe, as Trazyn had the first time, jump through the portal. But deploying a force that could best Orcs both in orbit and on the surface, that meant decades of travel through deep space. Or it would have, if not for Orokin and his mastery of the inertialess drive. The Astromancer had called up star charts and celestial grids, prescribed angles and parabolas, sketched a path through the whirling stars that shot them between the gauntlets of orbiting systems, around asteroid belts and through fields of naval debris, using the gravity of great suns to turn and redirect them without losing too much speed. A lesser Astromancer would have stopped or slowed them to turn. Orokin preserved the endless acceleration of void travel. By the end of the first solar cycle of the voyage, the craft moved only 1,000 leagues per hour. But by the end of the first year, they streaked through space 10 times faster than a Night Scythe. After 10 years, they travelled so fast that a mortal pilot would have been unable to control the craft, their limited reaction times and slow navigational calculations slamming the craft into a star or overdoing the gentle course adjustments. Most cryptechs could not even have done it, Trazyn admitted to himself. When they'd hit Serenade, they'd been going 1 billion leagues an hour. So fast, even a Necron ship could not go to full stop without tearing itself apart. Serenade's second moon blurred on the right side of the bridge's holoscreen, and Trazyn looked at the sleek lines of Orokin's ship ahead of them. It was a Scythe-class harvester in the Reaper configuration, an odd, spindly front-heavy class, Trazyn had always thought. Like a Cryptek staff of light hurtled through space, its stern fletched like an arrow. The Sortek, consummate empire builders, had ever loved their ships. Where the Nahailak hoarded treasure, the Sortek amassed military assets. The difference between an inward-looking dynasty and an outward-looking one, Trazyn thought. His fellow Nahailak were conservative, defensive, focused on holding what worlds they had rather than expanding outward. They extracted tributes and looted spoils, of course, but they were less interested in governing new systems than they were about claiming their wealth. Where the Sortek craved domination, the Nahailak nurtured spheres of influence, preferring to extend power through vassal states and tribute, rather than military force. That took fleets, but Nahailak flotillas tended to consist of a great number of smaller vessels, rather than a few large ones, to better spread its authority. A simple difference in naval doctrine, neither approach better nor worse. Or perhaps Trazyn was just making excuses, envious of how thoroughly Orokin's ship dwarfed his own Shroud-class light cruiser. It was a full mile longer, though Trazyn contented himself that most of that was due to the long spinal vein that stretched like an arrow shaft to the fletched stern assembly. Trazyn had his reasons for choosing the Shroud, of course. It was his personal craft, first off, which made its interior comfortable, and he liked that it was fast and quiet, able to run silent past most threats. And not being a military type himself, Trazyn feared a full battlecruiser might prove too much ship for him. But damn the shattered gods, he was still an overlord, and being shown up by some jumped-up court magician bruised the only thing of his that could be bruised, his pride.
"Achieving navigable speed, Overlord,"
intoned the helmsman of the Lord of Antiquity. Trazyn waved a hand at the crewman's head to open his thoughts. He scrolled through the mental data feed, watching the deceleration calculations spiral down, satisfied himself that it was being done well.
"Any sign of the Orkoids?" he asked. "Scry image, cast to commands Throne's projector, Overlord, enhanced to factor of 1000.
A chrysoprase projector in his throne arm shimmered, beaming a holographic model in the air. Trazyn leaned down, using his hand to rotate the display. Trazyn mused.
"Hail the Zodiac's fury."
From such a distance, the images were less than distinct, but they were clear enough to see that the Orc fleet was massive. 12 large vessels, bulbous and lantern-jawed, shoaled around the planet like the scavengers they were. Most were escort size or smaller, their hull silhouettes bizarre on account of continual reworking and modification. Strange, leg-like stalks, perhaps void elevators, stretched from several vessels to the planet's surface. One kill cruiser, larger than the others, stood so close to the planet's atmosphere that it seemed as if it might fall in. No prize, Trazyn thought, for guessing which was the war boss's ship.
"Hail accepted, my lord,"
said the signalman.
"Projecting."
Orokin appeared in hard light, patches of him flickering and going out as the signal wavered. He floated in the air, only slightly smaller than normal, legs crossed and hands woven into a symbol of power.
12 ships,
Trazyn chided.
"Didn't you predict 7?
Orokin bristled, causing the hood of his headpiece to flare outward.
"The Orcs are difficult to foresee. They travel the Empyrean, shift the very weave of reality around them.
It's not important,"
Trazyn cut him off.
"Our strategy remains the same, I suppose."
"Yes," responded Orokin. "We hit them hard and fast, cripple them with the initial assault. Then, as I engage the large ship and kill Boss Big Sore, you locate and secure the tomb with a defensive action."
"Just remember, Astromancer," Trazyn said, "I will have the Astrarium with me down there."
Yes, yes.
"So if you leave me stranded, it will be lost. In such an eventuality, my captain will turn his guns on the Zodiac's fury."
"And you cannot open the tomb without my equation," said Orokin. And should you try, I have the batteries and ground forces to make you quite regret it. I need no reminder that we each have a phase blade to the other's throat."
"Very well," Trazyn nodded, "provided we understand each other." Orokin gave a dust-dry cackle.
"Little hope of that, Archivist. But our accord is sealed. Transmitting attack vectors to the Antiquity now."
An interstitial data packet appeared on Trazyn's command throne, and he flicked a finger, casting it to the main holoscreen. It dominated the display, overlaying the image of the Zodiac's fletched stern to show the first curving tack towards the Orcs. In one corner of the holoscreen, a tactical chart showed the planned course in a simplified map. "One thing, Orokin. What are these?" Trazyn paused, sketching a finger along the protrusions linking the ships and surface. "These things?"
"I suppose we will find out, will we not?" Orokin said. "Prepare for your first turn on my order. 3.
Trazyn saw the Zodiac's Fury pivot like a boat sliding up to a quay, its constellation of hull lights flaring as the main reactor juiced extra power into its network of conduits and surface circuits. 2. Orokin's voice crackled out of the hologram. The Zodiac slid by the holoscreen, and the bridge of the Antiquity shivered as the hazy discharge of the bigger ship's inertialess drive washed over it.
1,
said Orokin. "Turn!" ordered Trazyn, and smiled at the predatory dip of the hologram Orokin's head. "I'm sorry. This ship only responds to the ranking overlord. You're not an overlord, as far as I'm aware. Are you, Orokin?"
"Keep to the charted course,"
Orokin said, voice tight with annoyance.
"And your arc batteries pointed away from me."
The hologram winked out. Trazyn chuckled, his laughter rising, becoming more throaty, echoing off the walls of the cavernous bridge. Deciding he didn't like the lonely sound, he waved a hand, and the bridge crew, hardwired into instrument cartouches and command cradles, hollowly laughed along with him. Yes, as Orokin said, they had a blade to each other's throats. But the stargazing fool didn't know that Trazyn also had a knife in the other hand, ready to plunge into the Astromancer's belly. Silence ruled the command deck of the Zodiac's Fury. Orokin preferred it that way. Better to preserve his navigational trances and tactical divinations. Instead of a command throne, he liked to sit floating in a repulsor field, surrounded by glowing phos-hologram celestial charts, spiraling predestination models and damage reports. A spider, lurking in a luminescent web. No one was to speak to him. Not the bridge crew, not the captain. All orders came through interstitial command, a thought network of instantaneous feedback that chained throughout the entire ship's complement. The chain radiated out from Orokin, to the bridge crew, to the operational sections, all the way down to the strike fighter pilots, already poised at the hangar bay doors. Orokin mimicked breathing to keep time, maintain focus. They were moving fast, 500 leagues per hour, approaching the first sawtooth glyph on his tactical map. In his deep well of a mind, he scried through the oculars of the fire control officer and saw the first Orc ship approach, a dot in the blackness off their starboard side, growing larger.
"Charge lightning arc array,"
he ordered. Billowing auroras rippled and collected in the hollow of the ship's crescent-shaped bow. A cloud of ambient solar energy pulled from the void and squeezed into a star-bright point. Any other species, even the Eldari, would consider this a technical miracle, but to Orokin it was no more incredible than melting lead into bullets.
"Target in range, Lord."
Orokin let the Zodiac close with the Orc vessel, held fire. Small objects began to bounce off the living metal of the Zodiac's prow. They were not shots. As far as Orokin knew, the little Orc cruiser was still unaware of the Necron ship bearing down on it. The Zodiac had entered the debris field that haloed every greenskin ship, a loose shower of screws, scrap and ejected waste that floated off the ramshackle vessels, even when they sat at orbital anchor. Orokin scanned thermal readouts, finding the heat plumes of the Orc vessel's propulsion system, and confirmed it was not bombarding them with any sensors. The Zodiac collided with a piece of ambient hull plating the size of a bomber. It skipped along the necrodermis and went spinning into space like a coin.
Fire!
The sunspot, collecting in the hollow of the Zodiac's crescent bow, leapt at the cruiser. Lightning bolts danced and crawled, touched its metal surface and quested for weak points. Prometheum tanks bolted to the outside of the ship's hull, ruptured in pressurized bursts, chemical components breaking up flameless in the oxygen-starved void. Absorbed in his chart, Orokin traced his fingers towards the largest vent plume on the cruiser's spine. Grunting, he flowed 20% of his consciousness down into the bridge circuitry and raced his way through the ship. He zipped and turned, following the power cables, running hot past the boarding parties preparing in the translation chamber, the engine keepers nursing the huge reactor drive, pouring a portion of his consciousness into the gunner Cryptek manning the arc battery. The being was slow, malfunctioning, still stiff from 60 million years of sleep.
Idiot!
He growled through the Cryptek's lips, and ran his fingers over the arc battery's control orb. Watched as a tendril of emerald electricity probed like a questing finger towards the main smokestack, dipped inside. With the Cryptek's other hand, Orokin locked the arcs in, cycled up the power. The lightning arcs gathered and joined the first, eager as if hungry. Bright flashes shone through the triangular portholes of the cruiser's bridge. They frosted with smoke, then blew outwards, the ship's interior oxygen soon burning off, so that the pillars of flame boiling at the vessel's eye sockets quickly retreated.
"There, that's how you do it,"
said Orokin, raising the gun officer's puppeteered hand and using it to strike the Cryptek across his own lean jaw.
"Do not make me come down here again."
Up in the bridge, the rest of Orokin's consciousness watched the cruiser heel over and come apart at mid-deck. One down. No fight in them. He scanned for life signs and found only a few hundred. He opened a hailing channel.
"Trazyn,"
he signaled, watching the Antiquity come up low on his port side, matching his speed.
"Confirm life form reading on that cruiser for me. A few hundred."
That is abnormal," Orokin said, hoping it did not sound like a question.
"Don't know much about orcs, do you, Astromancer?" "It is not my business to know the specifics of every barbarian culture and alien oddity," he snapped. "Is it abnormal or not?"
Trazyn chuckled, relishing knowing something that Orokin did not.
"The orcs stuff their craft bulkhead to bulkhead. Blow one apart and you're likely to see more green flesh in the debris field than metal. No, we likely detonated a cruiser full of Gretchen."
"What?"
"It's an invasion. The real orcs are down on the surface. Pick up your scanning. Half these vessels are empty."
Orokin looked at the mob of ships growing large in his forward holoscreen. Finally, a plan was going right. And that's when the dazzle of an interstitial alert flashed across his vision.
"Incoming! Incoming! Incoming!"
The Zodiac rocked, bridge crew jiggling in their command cradles and floor mounts as a rocket-propelled shell the size of a monolith crashed into the prow. Orokin drew up a scry view and saw an enormous crater in the starboard crescent wing. Wisps of ghostly energy trailed from the blackened, cauterized wound, reminding Orokin of a temple incense burner. Already, crackling energy wormed its way along the edges. Atoms realigned, reformed, creating a lattice structure. In the exposed decks, he could see repair wraiths firing particle beamers, refilling the latticework structure with healing necrodermis. Living metal, that which remained functional, flowed and shimmered back in to fill the gaps. Debris ejected from the wound tumbled back into place as if it were a mnemonic file running in reverse. Ahead, Orokin saw flashes dancing along the line of the Orc ships. It was no longer an ambush. It was a battle. Orc fire came in curtains, like a monsoon rain, punching, strobing, howling. Shells the size of battle tanks, dazzling blue light beams, little plinking impacts on the Antiquity's forward shields Trazyn swore were shooter slugs. That was how the orcs did it. No target priority or fire control, just unleash everything in a wall of ordnance. It wasn't so much about avoiding fire, it was about avoiding the heavy guns and beam weapons.
"Orokin," he signalled. "Drive straight at them. Present the narrowest silhouette. Vector up and down to create a moving target."
Orokin's hologram juddered and flashed as the Zodiac took another hit.
"Suddenly the great Void Nemesaur, are we? I have 2 cruisers and a bridge section from an Orc rock in the gallery. Trust me, their targeting systems aren't up to snuff, especially at range. They'll lose patience and close on us to ram and board." "Heh! So you want to continue straight at them? Oh, brilliant stratagem. We need them to break off so I can land. If we run, they won't chase us. But if we charge, we can get them to turn and commit. Burn their big rocket engines for us so they can't slow or maneuver. Then we dive under and scour their bellies."
Silence. Orokin's hologram floated, unmoving.
"Orokin, divinatory algorithms predict a 62 out of 100 chance of success." "Not bad. It's the best scenario I've run, given a failed ambush." "Very well, Trazyn. Zodiac's Fury turning prow on and increasing speed. Randomized vector grid. Oh, stars save us."
The hologram blinked out, and Trazyn turned to the divinations officer, slowing his chronosense and speeding his information packets so the conversation passed within a half-second.
"Are you tracking incoming?"
"Yes, Overlord." She was a cryptek, implanted in an Ulmari sphere command cradle that rotated her around the globe of phosglyph panels that surrounded her. 4 hands played over her glowing sensor suite. Void tiles dangled from the sides of her metal skull like earrings. "Scrying 19,000 plus objects, 12,000 of those on course for the Zodiac." The Antiquity shivered as a rocket that looked as if it might pass over them suddenly plunged jackknife crazy into their path. It detonated against the forward shield, bathing the ship's portside front arc in fire that boiled and died outside the protective emerald shell.
"Orcs always shoot the bigger one,"
Trazyn said.
"Indeed, Lord. Our incoming includes 262 objects of damaging strength or greater. Torpedoes, high-yield shells, rockets, energy beams of unknown composition. 64% of those are disabling strength. 21% will destroy the Antiquity in 1 or more strikes."
"Transmit to Helm. Helmsman, steer us through. Prioritize weaving around the biggest ones. Drive through the medium-yield ordnance if necessary. Technologos."
"Aye, Lord."
"Shield priority forward and topside. Match their angle of deflection. Weapons? Ready for orders. Find me a damn firing solution."
He pointed a long, pitted finger at one of the brutal fish-like craft, close enough now that they could see its blue paint job.
"On that one, the bulbous crate making the slovenly turn."
"The transport," the weapons officer said, wanting confirmation.
"It's not a transport,"
Trazyn said, a wicked tone in his voice.
"It's a torpedo boat."
Zodiac's Fury rocked with another impact. One of his phosglyph panels strobed until he sketched the sign of Hept to stabilize it. A damned torpedo this time. A prodigious one. Orokin had vectored up, and it passed below them, the faulty timer going off just under and behind their stern assembly, so that the Zodiac pitched forward on its nose like a diving raptor. The blast drove its topside shield directly into a blizzard of mid-sized shells that shorted it, allowing one to detonate against the midline spine column, the haft of this staff-like vessel that connected the prow module to the navigational fins at the stern. Red damage reports filled his vision. He scried into the head of a repair wraith and saw the necrodermis of the hull column shredded like a snapped twig, still held together by bark. The tail assembly wobbled precariously, wandering out of the teardrop-shaped shield that surrounded the craft. Orokin snapped back, dismissing warnings from his cluttered sphere of information. As soon as he swept away a damage report, a hologram appeared to replace it. "Everything all right, Orokin? There—" Orokin grabbed the doll-like projection of Trazyn and tossed it away. He was being too detailed, plotting too many eventualities, flying this ship with his head rather than by instinct, trying to calculate every move, being too perfect, trying to avoid every obstacle rather than take some hits. "Deploy extra rafes to spine column," he sent. "Helm, level out. New evasive pattern. Algorithmic flight pattern sent to—" The bridge shuddered with another hit. "Orokin," Trazyn said, hologram reappearing. "They're turning to face." He looked up. A stray rocket streaked above, but the hail of shot was slackening. Indeed, 5 of the big cruisers had come about. Orokin saw their furious, triangular eyes staring at him behind the thinning swarm of fire-bright torpedoes and glowing reactor shells. "Incoming torpedoes," said Trazyn. "I read life forms aboard. Boarders." "Thread them," Orokin ordered the helmsman. "And by the dead gods, get that spine array locked down." He gathered his fragmented consciousness, split between too many places throughout the ship's network, as he tried to manage the battle single-handed. "Trazyn, our ships are without atmosphere, unpressurized," Orokin said. "Do orcs breathe?" A pause. "They have lungs." "Prepare to repel boarders," Orokin signaled. "In case." The culture of the orcs had always fascinated Trazyn. Consider, after all, the madness of a social structure that would make beings not only willing, but eager to climb into a faulty torpedo and be fired between 2 moving starships. The things could, theoretically, steer towards a target, but when he'd taken samples, he'd found that the controls were usually decorative. It gave the Orc boys the opportunity to feel like they were doing something, but more often than not, the torpedo's helm controls weren't connected to anything. On top of that, the things had a limited fuel payload, meaning that if they missed, the tube of tight-packed greenskins had few options. This close to orbit, a few might get captured by the gravity well and, after a few weeks, succumb to orbital decay and immolate upon atmospheric entry. Those that shot out into the void itself would, he assumed, form a brief micro-society, primarily centered around brawling and cannibalism. These incoming boarders would not have that problem, of course. Trazyn would make sure of that. "Fire array!" Sheets of energy lanced towards the incoming hornet storm of torpedoes. They popped, one after another, like firecrackers, bursting in their centres and spilling green bodies that sizzled on the Antiquity's forward shield. One careened away, a glancing lick of electricity shorting its drive system and turning it into so much space junk. Orcs began clambering out of its side hatch, jetpacks flaring as they pushed off the surface of the torpedo and winged slugger shots at the Antiquity. A night scythe swooped in and atomized the stricken craft, taking its crew with it. At his flight officer's recommendation, Trazyn had deployed the scythe to create a screen once it was clear the cruisers were deploying small craft. Half the Antiquity's squadron was running interference on the Zodiac's weakened topside shield, the hit on its spine having grounded the ship's own fighters. Trazyn could see the Orc fleet nearing, saw-toothed jaws clearly visible without enhancement now. Swarms of void-proof fighter bombers alighted from the sides of the ramshackle craft. Trazyn swore that one cruiser had opened its fighter bays by blowing the explosive bolts on several huge panels, dropping the planks of hull plating astern like flower petals. An alert plastered his vision, accompanied by an obnoxious trilling noise. "Hull breach in aft engine temple, starboard side. Organic life forms detected." "Void Dragon gnawed their entrails," Trazyn snarled. "So one did get through. Warriors, give them a welcome. No need to overdo it. Do not damage the ship. That's one chamber away from our reactor." Hopefully, the warriors would be enough. He'd rather send the more reliable immortals, but those were all seconded for the landings. Boarding a Necron vessel was foolhardy. For one thing, as Orokin had pointed out, the atmosphere was no different than the void outside. No need for life support. The interiors were airless, unpressurized and freezing. Would that matter to an orc? Trazyn did not know.
"They're closing," said Orokin, his hologram wavering.
"Wait for it,"
said Trazyn.
"If they don't fire their ram rockets, they'll still be able to maneuver and—"
As if called, the ram thruster on the orc kill cruiser lit, the concussion of it nudging escort vessels aside, scorching their blue hull paint black with the heat wash. It screamed towards them, engine framing the craft in a corona of flame. Alongside it, 4 smaller cruisers fired up their own ram rockets and peeled off after their flagship.
"Are you prepared to vector down, Orokin?"
"Charging weapons. Vector on count of 3,
said the astromancer. He sounded distracted and stressed.
1.
2,
answered Trazyn. The orc armada loomed huge on the holoscreen, their courses already wavering with the uncontrolled burn. 2 cruisers drifted dangerously close to each other. In the bottom of the screen, the Antiquity's lightning arc gathered another crackling electrostorm.
3,
they counted together. Inertialess drives fired upward, dropping the 2 sicklecraft down under the brutish enemy vessels. It was close, so close that the image of the huge cruiser plummeting towards them reached down to a subconscious instinct from the times of flesh, and Trazyn found himself wanting to duck. A long whip aerial emerging from the bottom of one cruiser hit the portside wing and scraped along it before breaking off. To the orcs, it must have looked like their quarry had disappeared.
"Fire!"
ordered Trazyn. Coiling energy flashed upward as they sailed under the orc vessels, scouring their bellies. Liquefied metal pattered onto the Antiquity, ropey globules that tumbled, formless in the void of space. On contact with the cold hull, the metal froze in puddles.
"Keep firing! Focus on the torpedo boat!"
He swung the holoscreen's vision arc to starboard to watch Orokin's progress. The screen whited out, unable to handle the energy discharge it was witnessing, then added filters to bring the scry image back into focus. The Zodiac's Fury had fired its particle whip directly into the belly of the kill cruiser. At longer range, it would have lived up to its name, snapping out in great coiling arcs like a herdsman's lash, splitting the air with a crack that could rupture a mortal's eardrums. But at this range, and in the silence of space, it was like a curved knife. It sank deep into the flagstone's belly and dragged along the hull. Orange sparks, showers of molten metal and superheated matter bloomed from the long slice as Orokin's ship carved a quarter of the way down its length. A few more seconds, and it would slit the orc flagship front to back like a fish. It might have even torn the cruiser in 2, except at that exact moment the torpedo boat Trazyn was scouring went up. There may have been a warning rumble, but if there had been, it was swallowed by the airless, soundless void. Trazyn guessed it was a munitions detonation, which had, after all, been his object in targeting it. Orcs rarely had any compunction about proper ordnance storage, and regularly kept ammunition next to fuel sources, and vice versa. Perhaps a crude orcoid version of a fusion reactor, the dream of a particularly insane or talented mech, had overloaded and gone critical. All Trazyn knew was that the torpedo boat simply exploded, its rushing energy wave so powerful that it outran and incinerated any debris and drove the Antiquity downward, its overtaxed shield shimmering a weak shade of yellow that tinted the scene of destruction. The energy wave broke the formation, scattering the orc ships, tumbling them this way and that like tiny sailcraft in a storm. The Zodiac took the hit on its portside shield, and a good thing too, since with its top shield weakened, the blast might have severely damaged the big harvest ship. But the kill cruiser, stricken and seconds from void death, took the blast full force on its starboard side. The shockwave shoved it sideways through space, rolling it off the impaling beam of the particle whip, saving it.
"Trazen!" howled Orokin. "You hunchbacked old meddler! I had him! We could have finished it!"
Trazyn wasn't listening. He was getting his own alerts. "Lord," warned the Cryptek, manning the Techno-Logos panel. "Boarders are forcing the aft engine temple gateway. Engine guardians report weapons discharges in the—" Trazyn was already gone, his consciousness flashing out of the body of the captain he'd used as a surrogate. Down through the circuitry paths of the ship, feeling the hum and throb of the pentareactor grow stronger as he neared the aft engine temple, tasting the radiation as he rushed closer. When he flowed into the Lich Guard's body, he found himself face to snout with an orc. He fended it off with the haft of a war scythe, pulling and wrestling as the calloused green hands tried to tear it from his grip. The beast howled with the elation of slaughter. Beady eyes stared through flight goggles. Its thick tongue lolled against Trazyn's death mask. Trazyn kept a collection of intricate combat manuals, drill books for Necrontyr scythe and phase sword, each illustration demonstrating the beautiful efficiency of the ancient blade masters. The proper method to accomplish the Quesekin, the strike that disembowels and decapitates. How to use phase sword and shield to disarm the opponent with Nikenthal's blade trap. Stances for honor duels, for hunting, for war. None of them contained the move he did then. He was not a duelist, a hunter, or a warrior. What he was a monster. Trazyn slammed his head forward, shattering the orc septum. Finger-thick tusks scraped his face as the orc tried to bite him, but they slid off with an unpleasant screech of bone on metal. The orc was dead, skull crushed and forebrain mashed to jelly. The biting had been a post-mortem reflex. Trazyn shoved the orc away, speared its floating body with the war scythe, then ripped the blade outward to bury it in another greenskin's throat. Green blood, dark and globular, spurted in the gravity-free air. Only then did Trazyn have enough space for his perception suite to take stock. Above him, in the cyclopean vaults and impossible angles, he could see the burning trails of orcs flying and twisting in the reactor chamber. Huge rockets, strapped to their backs, belched flame and oily smoke. Some were repurposed pulse jet engines from land speeders. One was the booster from an Imperial torpedo. Another, most alarmingly, seemed to be a hunter-killer missile with its warhead still attached. Storm Boys. They weaved about in wild corkscrews and diving feints, more concerned with the delirious joy of fighting in zero gravity than causing irreversible reactor damage. But even so, there are few things in the galaxy more dangerous than an orc having fun. Trazyn saw two fall upon a Necron that was maglocked to the bulkhead, the ancient warrior's attention diverted by a third Storm Boy. The pair hacked and sawed at the warrior with their chain blades, grabbing limbs and yanking his body back and forth between them as it tore apart with a flaring light. The warrior phased and disappeared, ready to be reanimated in the vessel's rebuilding crypts, and the slighted orcs, annoyed at their truncated fun, swung at each other a few times before rocketing elsewhere to find new prey, the squig-fur collars of their jackets floating eerily in zero gravity. Killing them would, of course, be the wisest thing to do, but they were fascinating. The adopted human clothing, rough organization and chain of command. Oh well, if he found something better, he could always start over. Trazyn summoned a stasis beam and reached for an empty tesseract labyrinth. Orokin burned the Zodiac's engines, trying to disengage and get a better angle. He hailed the antiquity again.
Trazyn! Trazyn! Answer me, you malfunctioning imbecile!
He saw an alert, rolled the Zodiac over and down, deploying a comet tail of flickering dimensional matter that drew the heat-seeking rockets away to explode harmlessly behind his stern. The orc craft were clumsy and wounded, but they were many, and the Necron vessels few. and they were all beginning to reorient themselves after the torpedo boat's detonation. Predictably, they were on him like a death shroud, fixated on the Zodiac as the larger, more dangerous target. It made sense, in a twisted way. When the Pharaons struck out on their great hunts, they chose the largest, fiercest game as their quarry. The point was not to bring home the largest measure of meat, or even the best furs, but for honour, boasting rights that they'd killed the beast with the sharpest fangs, the largest bulk, an implicit declaration that they were the most powerful. This was no different. Necrons, orcs, power was power. Dead gods he'd been interacting with Trazyn too much. These were savages, and he would deal with them as such. "Charge the sepulchre!" he ordered. "It is time to show these barbarians the terror of civilization." Trazyn's consciousness poured back into the captain, bending her metal frame and twisting it to his specifications. "Report!"
"Cutting hard towards Serenade, Overlord," responded the divinations officer from her illuminated bubble of data. 2 orc vessels in pursuit, 1 cruiser, 1 escort ship. In your absence, the captain ordered a hard turn and evasive parabolas. Recommended we target the escort.
"The escort?"
She said we could outrun 1 cruiser, but 2 could maneuver to ensnare us. Our priority is to chart an atmospheric scheme and deploy the strike force, then play vermin and serpent with the orc forces, draw them away from the Zodiac.
"Well, it seems Captain Zakara has it well in hand. We do try to get the best."
"Nichaelek Ascendant," intoned the divination officer, and wheeled to address an incoming scatterplot of orc engine pulses versus thrust rate.
"Orokan," Trazyn said, opening a hail. "I'm descending to the translation crypt. My crew will take the Antiquity into an orbital run and release the strike force, then return to assist."
"Useless oaf! I had him! The battle could have been over in hours, and now—"
"The Antiquity will be there soon, Astromancer, but I really must get to the translation crypt. First beam fires in 2 minutes."
"Your ship had better return, Trazyn, or I will send the stars themselves to burn you. I'll call the primordial forces of deep space to rip every limb from—"
Trazyn cut the communication. "You heard our esteemed ally, bridge crew. Straight after the translation and night side launches, divine a course back to assist Lord Orokan."
"Aye, Overlord,"
they intoned as one. "But just 1 firing pass, eh? After that, evade to the far side of the 3rd moon." He smiled. "Lord Orokan can fight his own battles." Chapter 4. Greenskins killed my brothers and sisters, my cousins. Everyone I played with at the village Skolum would have killed me too, except I caught the grey stagger that spring, and my mother had taken me to the Medicae facility on Voltus Atoll for quarantine. We were very isolated there, heard little and saw less. The monsters would have got to us eventually, but you know what happened. Everyone does. Testimony of Malthus Rann, excerpted from They Drank the Seas, an oral history of the Greenskin War. Settlement Plaza, Serenade City. There were pipes, league upon league of pipes. Just before Trazyn stepped into the translation portal, he'd scried through the oculars of a Night Scythe reconnaissance pilot. Better to get visuals on the ground when one was stepping into a combat zone. What he saw intrigued him. Each proboscis reaching from ship to planet was a pipe. They were huge, each the width of a small house, made up of flexible plastic and woven fibre. Durable, but still able to bend. Some sections were brass, torn from some unfortunate city sewer system. The mad collection of hoses and pipes fed into the bellies of big orc cargo lighters, hanging just below the atmosphere. Elsewhere, boxy lifter craft, buzzing and snapping with barely contained energies, dropped what appeared to be huge nets into the sea. Flaring nodes turned the green water a vibrant blue. Then it collapsed in on itself, reduced to steam. No, not reduced to steam, Trazyn realized. Stolen. The buzzing, glowing nodes on the nets were teleporters. Up in orbit, in the belly of one of the great cargo ships, it was raining seawater. They were drinking the oceans. Already, Serenade's sea levels were dropping. Ironic, since he'd previously calculated that the burning of its rainforests had helped melt the planet's ice caps, raising the sea level roughly 6 ket. It mattered little. Once the Necrons landed in force, this would be a dead world. He stepped through the rippling emerald skin of the ship's portal and touched ground, the air around him smoking from the discharge of the translation. Around him was chaos. The closest point to the tomb, as far as he could tell, was the main plaza in Serenade City. He looked around to get his bearings. Trazyn had seen colony worlds many times. It was that rough-and-tumble transition phase between settlement and dominance where most of the territory remained frontier, and the humans clung to forts and outposts. 1 or 2 might grow above the size of a town, but even these tended to be modest. Serenade City sprawled near the island's port, a collection of pink 2- and 3-story buildings, built from blocks of coral quarried from inshore reefs. The houses rose up the slope in village-like clusters, each with a garden to supplement nutrition. High trees sprouted between the buildings, giving shade and rustling in the breeze. Wide verandas and slatted wooden doors spoke of a world where power generation remained sporadic, and instead of relying on hab conditioners, the populace would need to harness the trade winds to fight off the balmy humidity. Their roofs, carved wooden eaves supporting red tile baked from the iron-rich island soil, gleamed in the sun. Settlement Plaza, like all colonial plazas, contained a group of prefabricated buildings, likely brought in the first craft, a basilica of the God Emperor's Ascension, a governor's palace, an administratum office, and a barracks. There was nothing special about it, apart from the carved coral facades and the fact that 5 roads met in the plaza rather than the usual 4. That, of course, and that the administratum office was on fire. Curls of licking flame fanning out of the windows and threatening the buildings next door. Then there was the screaming. Trazyn stood behind a statue of an imperial martyr and took stock. Orcs were already in the square, big frames hounding after the civilians, who screamed and clutched belongings, fleeing uphill. One grabbed a woman with a meaty hand and opened its jaws wide to admit the struggling civilian's whole head. He might have managed it, too, if the lasbolt hadn't popped his skull open. The orc dropped the woman, felt his ruined skullcap with questing fingers, probing the brain matter still inside his cranium. Bellowing, he rushed towards the barracks, where the shot had originated, both enraged and sensing a better fight. Trazyn enhanced the image. A platoon of Serenade Frontier Rifles, a militia regiment in faded uniforms and nicked helmets, had clapped themselves inside the barracks, covering the downhill approaches from firing slits and hardened positions. Orcs surged up through the avenue leading to the port, waving choppers and stubby chain blades, peppering the plasteel bunker with a variety of weapons that dazzled even Trazyn's knowledge database. A quad-linked multi-laser answered them, strobing fire from the bunker into the orcoid throng, scything through them in a tumble of fallen heads and cauterized limbs. The greenskins did not stop. As bodies fell, they simply climbed over them, howling with delight that this hardpoint was putting up such a good fight. Their bodies stacked up in front of the mass fire of the bunker, mounding into a convenient ramp those behind could use to reach the firing slits. Trazyn turned away, drew out the Mysterios. They were close. The object vibrated in his hand, and he patted it like a small animal. Orokin seemed to believe the Mysterios had a kind of resonance with Serenade. At least, that's what Trazyn had found through years of infiltrating the Seer's cryptek circle. As Orokin worked, Trazyn watched. Indeed, the Astromancer had felt safe turning the Mysterios over to Trazyn, since he'd known it was useless without its algebraic incantation. But Trazyn had watched him practice the phrase over and over and over. Orokin was, after all, so very thorough. Trazyn spoke to the puzzle box, pored over the map it projected. This was the spot indicated, but it also was not good enough. Orokin said the opening point would be immediately below the plaza, accessed via a volcanic cave, but the world's unique geology was impervious to their sensors, making it impossible to bombard the surface with spectromancy and discover the entrance. A ground scan would, they assumed, be better.
"Sonnet!"
he called. The cryptek appeared at his shoulder, in a squeal of rending space-time.
"Lord, shall I signal the phalanx?"
"Cast a divinatory scry," he said. He noticed that Sanet was looking around, curious.
"Focus, loyal retainer."
Yes, Master, I apologize. It has been a long while since I left Solemnes."
"Find the entrance." He turned to the scene playing out before him, watching as an orc boy gained the multi-laser's firing slit and unloaded a huge slugger into it point blank. In the sky, a pencil sketch line arced overhead, its parabola terminating in a street upslope from the bunker. Pink houses erupted in flame, splinters of their carved wooden eaves spinning out to embed themselves into earth, trees, and neighbouring buildings. Trazyn looked out to sea and saw a great object trudging its way through the surf.
"Lord Archivist," said Sanet, "I have located the most likely ingress point to the crypt vault. It is out on the fringing reef, past the drop-off to the abyssal floor."
"Call the acquisition phalanx," Trazyn ordered. "Whatever formation Royal Warden Ashkot deems best. Death marks wherever make sense. Let him handle the details. Do not fire on the humans, so long as they're shooting at the orcs and not us." He stepped out into the plaza, summoning his empathic obliterator, slowing his chronosense so he could scry the entire plaza and commit it to his engrammatic matrix should he decide to recreate the scene. And striding towards the orcs, he laughed with recognition as his archival sub-program filed the scry scan under a previous engram. It was the same 5 Avenue plaza he defended with his Lich Guard, 8 millennia past. But back then, the Basilica of the God Emperor's Ascension had been the Eldari's World Spirit Temple, the Administratum Complex a monastery, the bunker a fine artificial forest grown from lizard bone, its top boughs like the branching of fan corals. Birds clustered around the central fountain, too stupid or frightened by the battle to flee. When they looked at him, turning their heads sideways to regard him with their enormous unblinking eyes, he realized they were not birds at all, but feathered lizards. Pale yellow scales showed on their bellies, their fluffed red plumage embedded in leathery reptilian skin. "Oh, how the mighty are brought low," he thought. Trazyn raised his obliterator and ignited the artifact within, so it flared with a malign hum, radiating a light that was not light. An orc at the edge of the attack turned away from the lasfire, pouring out of the bunker, and saw him, bellowed a challenge that sent his lips flapping. Trazyn crushed him with a downward stroke, mashing the fungal creature to the plaza. The obliterator's headpiece activated, and a blast wave rocked through the mob of green flesh. Worm lightning leaping from body to body in a cone of howling balefire. Nimbuses of corpuscent surrounded metal weapons and buckles. Sluggers exploded, their ammunition detonating inside their magazines and shredding brutish fingers. Chain blades whirred out of control until their engines burned out with a cough of ozone. Helmets, turned griddle-hot by the energy flash, seared their owners down to the skull. The closest orcs simply disappeared. Flash burned out of existence to the point that the only thing that remained of them were silhouettes on the cobblestones, the area around them scorched black. Fire from the bunker slackened. Green heads turned, regarding this new and more interesting threat. And behind Trazyn, the air rent. A line of Lich Guards stepped through the glowing, spitting wound in space-time, shields forward, swords aloft. In the centre stood Lich Captain Ashkut, Royal Warden. He bellowed a challenge, aloud so the orcs could hear it, and no fear in whatever small part of their brain perceived such a thing.
Calleth halt!
The Lich Guard responded by hammering their dispersion shields with the pommels of their face swords. Once. Twice. In Trazyn's vision, the glyph for conquest appeared, overlaying his view of the battle. They advanced, formation splitting to engulf Trazyn and get him behind them. Another rank was already coming through the tear in reality to join them.
Calleth halt!
Bang! Bang! Pommel on shield, the glyph pulsing again.
Calleth sep!
The line stopped a pace short of the orcs, swords poised, silent and unmoving. Trazyn was not a warrior, never had been, did not, overall, particularly like fighting. He generally considered face-to-face combat a failure. He preferred his enemy to be unarmed and facing the other direction, or better yet, 1,000 leagues away and unaware of his presence. But seeing Ashkut's display filled him with pride. The pulsing chant, the eerie stillness, the gleam of sunlight on burnished turquoise and gold. He'd never been a dynastic partisan, considered himself beyond that pettiness. But at this moment, standing in this plaza in the raiment of war, his central reactor cycled a little faster with the memory of ancient glories. The orcs, for their part, howled in approval. A few beat their own weapons together in clumsy imitation of the Lich Guard's martial prowess. Then they surged forward like the surf.
Nichaelek Ascendant!
Cried Trazyn, lost in the moment. The Lich Guard responded with a charge. Dispersion shields slammed muscle with bone-cracking force. The leading wave of orcs staggered back into their comrades, bellowing in anger and confusion as the ranks behind sent them careening back onto the wall of shields and vibrating blades. Fey swords chopped down, passing in and out of dimensions to bypass helmets and skulls, monomolecular edges carving through brains and corded necks, lodging in thick ribs and tough, fibrous organs. A whole rank of orcs fell, mutilated at their feet. Ashkut shouted, and the Lich Guard advanced a step, metal feet crunching skulls and bursting viscera as they trod, uncaring through the charnel dead. One Lich Guard stepped back out of the advancing ranks and collapsed, his death mask chewed to tatters by a chain blade. Bare actuators, severed and leaking sticky reactor fluid, sparked with deathlight. Sanet knelt and began resurrection protocols. The ranks closed, not even glancing back at their fallen comrade. "Revered Lord," an interstitial message. "This unworthy one is Scytheflight, Scout 2. I apologize for speaking directly to you without prompting, but I have protocols to notify you directly of imminent threat." Upslope, another group of Habs detonated, raining pieces of red tile down on the plaza. Ashkut and his force stepped forward and sank their reverberating blades deep in orc flesh. "Speak, Scytheflight," Trazyn signalled. "Request you scry into my unworthy oculars, Lord." Trazyn did, and his hydraulics pumped faster, threat response triggering. At first, he thought he was looking at some great battleship. Then, a collection of battleships chained together. Then, he saw the face. The angry eyes. It was a Gargant, taller than any building in Serenade City, save the Imperial Basilica. Both super-heavy vehicle and religious icon. It glared over a jaw bristling with flamers, so a line of bright fire danced in place of the sawtooth underbite of most orc craft. Ape-like arms swung from its thick-set shoulders, each terminating in enormous buzzsaws. A bulbous cannon, fat and wide-mouthed, sprouted from its belly. They were towing it on a barge, pulled by 2 orc tugs that were all engine and threw out wakes of white water and spilled fuel oil. They were headed for the shallow table of the fringing reef. And if they launched it there, it would crush the coral flat, collapse tunnels, ensuring they missed their chance to open the tomb, maybe, as Orokin predicted, destroy it entirely. Above, Trazyn saw the dirty smoke trails of Storm Boys coming down on Serenade City.
"That's good,"
said Trazyn. "Clear them faster. We need to make the reef."
"Sound good,"
he shouted. As one, the entire line of Lich Guards dropped to their knees, shields guarding their front in a low wall, and the second rank, composed of immortals, opened up with their Gauss blasters. The orcs melted, howling mouths disintegrating to ash, leaving nothing but a disembodied wail. Striking arms swung forward as corded muscle and connected on the kneeling Lich Guard as stripped bone. An orc boy, furious at this unsporting turn, emptied an entire magazine at the immortals, only to see his slug snuffed out of the air like candle flames before he, too, was sanded down to nothing. Gauss beams swept the plaza clean, disassembling even the bodies, so nothing blocked the Necron advance. Orokin checked Trazyn's position, rechecked it. Bastard was going too slow, far too slow. He banked the Zodiac into the planet's orbit, burned his inertialess drive to slingshot around the other side. There were 5 orc vessels on him. 5. He'd taken multiple hits. The lightning arc battery was damaged beyond the Wraith's abilities to repair it. The article whip had only enough power for one last shot, and only 3 days from the mysterious opening. He had expected Trazyn to betray him, and perhaps he had, in a way. The Antiquity was only assisting him in the most cursory manner. It had drawn off 2 of the escorts and disappeared to the far side of one of Serenade's moons. His divination still claimed it was making combat passes out there, but he doubted it. Trazyn had decided to tie him up in orbit. What Orokin had not expected was to miss the Mysterios's opening due to Trazyn's incompetence. The Zodiac shot around the other side of Serenade, coming up behind the orc craft, unleashed its particle whip directly into the gaping engines of a cruiser, ravaging one huge booster pod so badly it blew out and sent the craft spinning away end over end as the now lopsided engines threw it off course. That was it for the particle whip. He'd been running things too close to the reactor's red line. The Zodiac needed time to recharge and cycle coolant. Only one weapon remained. He hadn't wanted to give Trazyn the Mysterios in the first place, but she had said it was the only way, a claim his own visions confirmed. For the tomb to open, Trazyn must be holding the Mysterios. Orokin hated to think so, but it appeared the Archivist had some role to play in this drama. But Orokin had neglected to tell him the proper algorithm chant to activate the device. And when the tomb did open, well, then all the auguries declared that Orokin would be the victor.
"Lord,"
his weapons cryptek signaled.
"Sepulchre is charged."
"Finally," he responded. "Activate on my command." He punched the control orb, sending the Zodiac plunging between the orc vessels. A wolf among sheep. For 10,000 years, the coral shelf had built itself around the island, living polyps building on their dead ancestors, an eternal cycle of civilization and extinction, death and life. A form of complex urban life cycle that, in a way, was no less intricate than the city that occupied the land. Left to its natural course, the island would erode and shrink backward, retreating from the reef shelf, until it encircled the green land like the halo of an imperial saint. The island would die, worn away until it collapsed beneath the waves, and only the reef would remain, an atoll, a skeletal structure that had grown around what was there long ago, but was now hollow. Metal feet crushed brain corals and fine pink lattice fans as the phalanx walked out onto the reef shelf. Every footstep caused irrecoverable damage, stamping an imprint into it. Living metal meeting living stone. It was not, Trazyn reflected, the first time these leaden souls had crushed a civilization. He had ordered it himself when he deemed it appropriate. But he pitied the reef and its endlessly artistic polyp colonies. The bright yellow fish stranded in tide pools. Perhaps he could save a part of it in the gallery. The Orc's sea-draining endeavours had dropped the water level far enough that only a hand's width of water covered the reef. Trazyn's warriors made their implacable advance untroubled by waves. The surf, often pounding, had been reduced to ripples, sweeping by their ankles. The table reef stretched half a league out to sea, where the Gargant loomed.
"Death marks,"
Ashkut said.
"Target that fortress, Wodkar. Any green skinhead you can see."
"No," snapped Trazyn. "The tugs. Shoot the tugs."
"Yes, my lord,"
Ashkut corrected.
"Hotmaster, target the barbarians on their little ships."
Ahead, behind a knobby head of rock that protruded from the reef, Trazyn saw the marksman step from nowhere, only a wisp of purple vapour betraying the doorway to the hyperspace oubliette. They lowered their long synaptic disintegrators and snapped shots towards the tugs, energy beams spearing across the flat reef. Trazyn enhanced his ocular image and saw orcs on the lead tug drop, bodies falling limp as their neural pathways severed. At the ship's wheel, the helmsman sneezed blood onto the frosted glass of the wheelhouse and slumped on his controls. The tug drifted to starboard, its chain pulling the great barge sideways, halting its progress. Then the Gargant fired. It was as if a starship had crashed upon them. The coral shelf rocked. Fissures split open, racing along it with the sound of grinding stone. The death marks vanished, along with the rock outcropping they'd hidden behind. Water rushed to fill the deep shell hole blasted into the reef. A piece of an arm fell near Trazyn, hydraulics discolouring the water around it to a milky yellow.
"Disperse!"
shouted Ashkut.
"Advance! Loose formation!"
Immortals and Lychguard scattered in a wide grid, maximising the amount of space between them. A night scythe dived on the Gargant, lightning arc battery scouring its rough-plated shoulder. The Titan swung one of its massive arms and swatted the fighter transport out of the air, one enormous buzzsaw shearing through its wing. "It doesn't matter," Trazyn thought. "We have no weapons heavy enough for this, not to prevent it landing." The low-slung cannon boomed again, retracting into its housing. Recoil rocked the Gargant back so hard the barge slammed backward, its prow rearing out of the water. The enormous machine scraped a few foot towards the stern. Trazyn heard the freight rail sound of the shell coming. Knew there was nothing he could do. He distantly felt the blast rock the coral beneath him, throw him through the air so he saw the turquoise of the ocean and orange-pink of the sunset-painted sky. The blast had torn away both his legs and one arm, charred his skull and torso until he was nothing but a reactor and logic processor in a fused hunk of metal. Trazyn did not concern himself with these details, because he had a plan. Deep in the catacomb galleries of the Zodiac, a reverberation took hold of the living metal. The ship's frame vibrated with a sound like tolling bells, a funerary reverberation that shook the living metal so hard maintenance scarabs clattered on floors, and cryptechs nursing the reactors magnetically locked themselves down. It emanated from the Sepulchre Crypt, a holdfast where not even the ship's senior officers were permitted to venture. The cryptechs chosen to keep the tomb were a hermetic cabal, their network meditation chants restraining the weapon's violence until it could, if only briefly, be released. If simply left to run, it would tear the ship apart. The tolling agitated the very air, sound waves penetrating even the sonically deadened plates of the ship's hull and passing through the void beyond. though how it did so with no atmosphere to travel through was beyond even Orokin's understanding. And as the astromancer monitored his divinatory reports, he saw that the Orc ships had begun to vibrate as well.
"Open a Pierce channel to the Orc ship,"
he signaled to the dispatch officer.
"I wish to hear what's going on inside."
The audio cut in over loud, so blaring that he had to dial his auditory transducers back to hear the discord that held sway on the Orc flagship. Inside their armoured bulkheads, behind their massive weapons and clad in muscle, more resilient than all but hallowed necrodermis, the Orcs were screaming. Not screams of bloodlust and joyous slaughter, but the howls of sentient creatures reduced to base animalism. Pain without understanding. Fear of things that dwelled in darkness. The mad discovering a new depth of madness. Weapon discharges. Cleaver blades meeting with blacksmith tones. Orokin smiled. He had not known whether the weapon would work on Orcs. When used on the Eldari, the Sepulchre's psychic wave unleashed glimpses of the Empyrean, waking nightmares so horrifying that it reduced stalwart warriors to lunatics gripped with seizure, unable to control their own bodily functions. Others, the stronger and less fortunate, would rage against the terrors that surrounded them in the ether, striking down comrades and tunneling through ship systems with their bare hands, though it tore their fingers to shreds. Given the Orcoid nature, Orokin was unsure whether it would simply increase the monster's violence. With luck, Boss Big Saw would be killed in the melee. Orokin opened his star charts, made adjustments, inscribed a zodiac of his own devising, and calculated the shifting sands of the future.
No! No!
He recalculated, changed variables.
Trazyn, you bastard!
Plans called for Trazyn to defend the entrance of the cave, not to enter, for in doing that, the strange geology of Serenade would cut him off from fleet and ground communications. No signal in Orokin's cryptic arts could penetrate the planet's crust. He could not deploy his forces beneath the surface via translation, or even extract them to be rebuilt and resurrected in the Zodiac's forge. Any Necron who died in the tunnels would see the end of their eons-long journey. Trazyn was to wait until Orokin made landfall and met him. It was the deal. Orokin had not truly expected him to honour it, of course, but he had not expected his cheating to gain him such an advantage that the tomb would be his. She had promised him that would not happen, that while Trazyn had a role to play in the opening, Orokin did as well. After the tomb was opened, she had said, Trazyn could be dispatched. Yet Orokin's astronomical calculations told a different tale. From his base at Mandragora, the celestial alignment spoke victory, but here, in the backwater space of Serenade, the stars were bad. Little delays here and there had thrown off his calculations, or else some event he did not understand had reordered the energy lines of heaven. Casting a zodiac depended much on the exact moment one did it. The stars did not necessarily change, but the algorithm did. Now he saw the Scholar Ascendant, opposing and ruling the Mystic. The metal worlds in the House of Discord, indicating a dynastic war. The constellation Monolith, ruling over all. A great power unleashed. Trazyn would open the tomb without him, unless he acted, unless he changed his stars. Because Orokin also saw that the time of opening was upon them, the constellations and cosmic powers aligning to direct all the etheric energies to this crux in the spaceway, this lodestone of Serenade. And that meant that the stars were shining on him, stronger than he had ever felt. All at once, the discord in himself, the feeling of being torn and incomplete, became clear. He was disjointed because he could feel the disassociation of his energies, like a great block grinding into place on a temple's foundation, protesting and teetering until it fell into its niche in the great wall. A moment of dangerous weakness and destabilization before strength took hold. Orokin knew. He knew how he would confront the scholar. He changed his algorithms, cast his zodiac, and cursed. But not in frustration. This time, he blasphemed in awe.
"Translate the Curian here,"
he ordered, indicating a point on the map.
"Take with you the entire complement of wraiths. Then march, travel deep, gain the tomb, and halt whatever Trazyn is attempting to accomplish."
"And you, Lord?"
It was his plasmancer, Keetak of the Burning Hand. Orokin did not trust military beings, did not understand them. Indeed, he did not trust Keetak. But Orokin knew that the plasmancer wished patronage for his solar research, a venture Orokin was happy to fund and lend expertise to, if it, at least for a time, bought him the loyalty and destructive power of a talented tech sorcerer.
"I will see you there,"
responded Orokin. Then he said no more, for the stars had aligned their power and bathed him in light, trillions of years old, and he was already changing. Trazyn spurred the Lich Guard to run the moment his consciousness flowed into the surrogate.
"Follow me!"
he shouted.
"Nichaelak Ascendant!"
At the same time, he sent it as an interstitial command, rocketing the message through the combat net that helped the Lich Guard strike as one, enabled the death marks to fire at precise intervals, and controlled the targeting matrix of the Immortals so no two of them shot at the same enemy. He was already sprinting, running straight at the rearing Gargant. Necrons were implacable beings, unstoppable, but not known for their speed. Yet when called upon, the legions of cold steel could run. Metal toes dug into exposed reef. Skeletal forms hunched forward into the swarm of shots that buzzed around them, spattering their forms with strikes on the water and clipping metal arms.
"Rush it!"
he shouted.
"Don't let the cannon get range."
The coral rocked as another shell landed well behind them, the enormous cannon moving jerkily level to try and readjust to the running targets. Its barrel tracked first left, then right, unsure of where to point, trying to compensate for the rocking of the barge. 200 cubits away. Trazyn had never led a charge before. He found it exhilarating. His systems sang with the illusion of adrenaline that came from the central reactor throbbing in his chest. Hydraulics pumping, threat grids and bright-painted targets splashing across his vision. He saw orcs crowding the firing platforms on the Gargant's thick shoulders and head, pouring fire down on them. An immortal next to Trazyn pitched backwards, some kind of energy weapon severing his spine. The soldier recovered himself and crawled through the shallows, clutching at corals and holes filled with needle-sharp sea urchins in his compulsion to continue the charge. His fellows, driven to win glory for the dynasty, trampled him until his broken form began to seize and leak clouds of green fluid that flashed from electrical discharges. A thunderstorm in miniature. To Trazyn's right, a Lich Guard's foot dropped into a hole in the reef, and she collapsed forward. The orcs must have noticed the still target, because a line of bullet detonations ripped up her back.
"One warrior phalanx!"
Trazyn ordered.
"Stop and provide fire. Keep their heads down."
100 cubits. Cold green beams lanced over Trazyn's head, sweeping the upper decks of the Gargant, stripping channels in the armour as if they were fingers in clay, leaving burnished silver gullies behind. Orcs ducked, growling with annoyance. One or two that didn't get down took the beam's full force and fell backward, missing the front 2/3 of their skulls. Trazyn saw the big saw-capped arms cock backward to swing at the onrushing Necrons. At the Gargant's base, a desperate orc mech tried to reattach a snapped guy wire. The gesticulating war engine yanked the cable out of his hands, sending severed fingers spinning away. The mech waved towards the monstrosity's command module, trying to get the pilot's attention, to warn of the destabilization occurring at the machine's base. But when the big machine swung, another guy wire snapped, lashing out with such force it cut the mech and 2 other deckhands clean in half.
"Get aboard! Swarm it!"
The great cannon roared one last time, and Trazyn knew they'd done it. The volley fell short. shrapnel scything through the first rank of Necrons. Warriors and elites alike fell mangled, and Trazyn, with artificial slowness, saw the piece of shrapnel that would kill him. It was the size of a hand, and spun towards his face like a throwing knife. He activated the cloak, found a future where he survived, and took it. The chunk of scalding steel rammed into his shoulder, sinking deep into the living metal and sending off a shriek of damage reports. His left arm went limp. Trazyn shrugged it off. Fixable. Already he could feel his necrodermis pushing against the intervening object. Then he was at the edge of the reef, and leapt, obliterator raised. He landed on the end of the barge and crushed an orc ribcage with a hammer blow of his obliterator. He sprinted on, dodging and wheeling to get around the huge gargant's side.
"Follow me! Go wherever I go!"
A proximity alert sounded, and he leapt forward as a buzzsaw the size of a Leman Russ shrieked by, throwing sparks as it carved into the barge deck. A whole phalanx of immortals and warriors flew into the air, dismembered pieces scattering.
"Don't stop to fight them," he ordered. "Get around this side. Then the—"
An axe clanged off his armoured hood, and he wheeled, meaning to grab the offending orc's tusk with his offhand and deliver a shot of etheric energy with his obliterator. But his arm merely twitched, the hunk of shell still embedded in his shoulder. And before he could bring his obliterator around, he felt brutish fingers close on his wrist and a celebratory howl from behind him. Seeing the obliterator immobilized, the orc who'd hit him grappled his chest and brought him down. 2 orcs piled on him, then 3, pounding, firing pistols that hit each other as much as him. Iron-shod boots scraped his pitted chestplate. He saw the orcs up close, detachedly analysing their rank breath, fungus beer, roast squid and human flesh, feeling their incredible strength as they pummeled him against the deck. There were so many.
"Oh, keeps his head!"
one shouted.
"Oi! He's my tinny git! Get off, yous!"
They kept piling in. Trazyn estimated that there were 20 to 30 on top of him, their weight pinning him down to the patchy panels of the barge deck. A deck that was starting to tilt. He heard clanging feet. The Decurion, piling in around the orcs. The deck tilted further. His back ground against the uneven plating as gravity took hold. Water lapped around his pinned head. The weight on Trazyn lessened as an orc tumbled off with a splash. He scried through the press, saw the gargant turning on its big treads, winding up for another swing. The huge tracks slid forward with an unbearable squeal of metal on metal. Slowly at first, then faster as the pitch of the deck accelerated its fall. And then Trazyn was sliding too, heaps of orcs rolling away as the barge began to capsize. He let it happen, happy to be carried off the craft and into the warm water as the gargant carved a bloody track through the orcs and necrons that still clung to the barge's deck. Trazyn grabbed a handhold at the end of the barge, well below the waterline. The starboard side of the deck was nearly 4 cubits under water by the time the gargant passed above him, eclipsing him in shadow as it overbalanced and plunged head-first into the surf. Trazyn watched it sink, its illuminated eyes and strobing searchlights lighting up its drowning crew, until, one by one, its electrical systems winked out, succumbing to the abyss. Blood, thick and dark, covered the corridors of the orc flagship. Bodies choked its gangways and cabins. What remained of the crew had turned on each other, butchering without objective. The slaughter knew no rank or privilege. Snotling hordes swarmed over larger orcs, stabbing at eyes and clogging throats. Mobs eradicated everyone else in their gallery, then fired upon one another. There was a weapon, Orokin remembered, a device Trazyn had mentioned during their communiques on orc tactics. He did not care to remember its name, but the greenskins used it to fire their smaller kin through the horrors of the immaterium, ensuring they exited the tunnel so mad they mangled anything they landed on. It was as if the whole ship had been fired through such a device. Orokin, empowered in his light form, walked among them like a god. The first orc to charge him, he immolated with a touch. The squad that followed, he shot through with electric bolts that struck from his staff without him even conjuring them. 20 greenskins screamed and fled, believing him to be one of the nightmare creatures who had torn into their collective mind's eye. In a way, they were right. He shot directly through the fleeing mob like an arrow, leaving a tunnel of cauterized flesh where he passed. The orc ship was not a single vessel. It was multiple salvage ships cobbled together, fused and twisted like the crypto thralls some of his order fashioned out of a particularly hated foe. It took time to find the bridge, and when he did, Boss Bigsaw was not there. The bridge crew were elites, large, aggressive, well-armed. Orokin did not fight them. He was running out of time. Instead, he ripped open a bulkhead and watched them blown out into the void, clawing and swearing, ice crystals forming on their gummy eyes. He saved one, brought it pain so excruciating that even an orc could not endure it. "Where is the warlord?" The answer made him feel imbecilic, despite his shining aspect. The doctor was in the infirmary. Orokin discovered him by following the screams, knew he'd found the right place when he saw the display room of vivisected bodies. Orcoids of every size, humans, various forms of plant and animal life sewn in a variety of combinations. Men with the wings of birds sprouting from faces, orc heads grafted to the trunk of a great tree, arms hanging down like boughs. Moving creatures with robot torsos and flesh limbs, a whimpering Gretchen, permanently wired into a gyroscope of unknown function. Boss Bigsaw did not follow the dictates of genus, species, or kingdom. It seemed to Orokin very inefficient. The boss himself stood in the center of an operating theater, covered in gore. He was enormous and mismatched, with rings of pink scar tissue betraying where he'd grafted his pinhead on the hulking chest of a larger orc. Cybernetic hands, one a spinning bone saw and the other a crude surgical clamp, were sunk deep in the chest of what, only moments before, had been a soldier of the Serenade Frontier Rifles. Blood founted from his sawing and bile spewed in his piggish face. The pain boy snorted to clear his breathing passages, and saw Orokin. His eyes went wide.
"What a specimens! I wonder what's inside ya."
He snapped his pincer for emphasis. Orokin came closer, and it was Bigsaw's turn to scream. Trazyn stepped off the barge and sank, descending into the fathomless depths. Behind him, the Decurion stepped off in ranks, sinking behind him in solid lines. As they reached the twilight bottom, his feet touched soft padding, a meadow of seagrass, bright yellow, or at least appearing such, in the green light of their reactor glow and weapon tubes. In this twilight realm, every Necron burned like a candle, sickly light emanating from behind their ribs and bright oculars. 100 cubits distant, he could see the shadowy line of the Gargant resting on the sandy bottom, large grey fish patrolling it in predatory circles, snatching up the bodies that were still floating free from the hulk.
"Sonnet,"
he said, voice carrying easily through the water.
"Deploy a Tesseract field, the large one. You do not wish me to accompany you into the caves, Lord?"
"No," he shook his head. "Recover what warriors you can, but after that, I want that Gargant. With luck, we can even render it operational for display."
"I pity we do not have a doom scythe,"
his servant said, slapping away one of the predators as it gnawed tentatively at his hand.
"We might not have lost so many men."
"Of course we had a doom scythe," Trazyn snorted. "But how would I have displayed it? Do you want to fix that kind of damage?" Then he turned towards the cave, raised his obliterator, and lowered it again to point at the mouth. And the warriors of Nekhailak marched, luminous, into the watery darkness. 3 days they walked, deeper into the abyssal cave network, winding and twisting, sometimes up, sometimes down, always in darkness. At times they passed chambers whose ceilings opened to the world above, sending angelic shafts of light into the grotto. Here, reef systems sprouted, unseen by any mortal eye. Bright orange fish weaved and nestled through the corals, nosing through the imperial purple grasp of tickling anemones. Turtles the size of imperial ground cars, lacking any fear of the intruders, nosed at the marching warriors as they glided by. Trazyn found himself particularly taken with an octopod, the same rich turquoise as his Nekhailak colours. The creature, surely attracted by his heraldry, attached herself to his shoulder plate. He collected the specimen as a souvenir. Not all was so serene. Blind eels, thicker than Trazyn was wide, and with teeth that overlapped like the fingers of folded hands, slid and wriggled through the lightless caverns. One attacked a phalanx of immortals and had to be slain, its inky blood further reducing visibility. With each fathom, the eels got larger, until they discovered one that, were it not so decomposed, might have been 1/3 of a mile long. Foul hagfish burrowed through its flesh, their web-like slime clogging the chamber so thoroughly they needed to clear it with Gauss fire. The Mysterios vibrated the entire way, singing along with an ethereal resonance Trazyn could not hear. Days in the dark worked on one's imagination, it was true, but he could swear it was beginning to shift as they descended, its angles and vertices sliding and rearranging, unstable. He knew the chamber when he saw it. It was monumental, large enough to fit one of the Orc escort ships in its cavernous space. Trazyn had not seen its like except in the largest Imperial faith centres and Eldari craft worlds, and in Necron tomb worlds, of course, which is what this was. He was well within the chamber before he realized it. So thick lay the silt on the floor. Tubules, the kind that lived off undersea volcanic vents, obscured the ribbed struts that held up the ceiling. Normally, these sponges, tubes and skittering shrimp would be clinging to the side of a fissure, living off the nutrients that leaked up from Serenade's magmic blood. But here they had found an altogether more potent food source. At the far end of the chamber stood a cyclopean double door, its panels covered with organic growth so thick that he could barely see the radioactive green light cast from between its cracks and glyph carvings. That same deathlight emanated from every living creature in the cavern, from the dully glowing strands of kelp to the bioluminescent schools of fish. All reflected the same unhealthy radiance. A radiance that would kill them, Trazyn noted. As a long, thin fish slipped by, he could already see the tumours clustering beneath its skin, a gift of what the great doors concealed, the kiss of Necrontyr.
"Incredible," said Trazyn. "It's an eternity gate." "Is it dangerous, my lord?"
asked Ashkut, hand drifting to his phase sword.
"Oh, very,"
Trazyn chuckled.
"It's a doorway to an interdimensional chamber, a place between, like the hyperspace oubliette where the death marks wait between firing positions. The perfect hiding place for anything you do not want found, but quite toxic to all but our kind." "It is harmless to us." "My dear Warden, the entire galaxy is harmless to us."
"And?" He paused, and Trazyn watched his retainer's curiosity war with his sense of decorum.
"What is inside?"
"An age long past." Trazyn patted the commander's back, a gesture made slow by the water. "And perhaps the key to an age yet to come. Do not trouble your matrix with the weighty matters of history, Ashcott. See to the strategic details.
I will secure the chamber,
he nodded, and Trazin caught a hint of relief in that voice.
There's a good soldier.
Defensive line where you think best. Immortals and death marks up high, perhaps. Lychguard halting in advance.
Indeed, Lord.
Trazin reached into his dimensional pocket and withdrew the Astrarium Mysterios, his hands passing over the Tesseract labyrinths nestled beside it. As he crossed the chamber to the Eternity Gate, he could already feel the Mysterios folding and turning, angles making impossible shapes as they twisted in and out of reality. It slid so much in his grip that he held it with 2 hands. Schools of fish gathered like a multitude of worshippers around a prophet, nosing at the light emanating from the Mysterios' runes. For they were no longer Necron glyphs, but a language so ancient Trazin did not recognize it, and, indeed, would not be able to read it if he did. Each character seemed to change depending on the angle he viewed it. They were water-like, spiraling eddies in his peripheral vision, and geometric proofs when he looked at them straight on. Despite his curiosity, he tried not to do that, for when he did, his oculars lost focus, the image crazed like a smashed window. Was this the warp-infused writing of the Old Ones? A script he'd once translated so easily, but had forgotten when he'd lost his soul? Soon, he could not see it anyway. The Mysterios was now boiling the water around it, cloaking it in a torch flame of bubbles that drifted to the cavern's high ceiling. Clouds of shrimp, mistaking the release of heat for a new volcanic opening, wriggled towards the Mysterios and died, their bodies forming a carpet that crunched under Trazin's feet. The door was responding, its glyphs burning away the layers of oceanic sponges and calcified coral to reveal the message radiating out of the clean black stone. Hail, Seeker! I, Vishani, lay this curse. Here sleeps Nepareth, Pharaon of Amunos, the one called the Untouched, conqueror of stars, slayer of gods and immortals. Open and be damned. Trazin staggered, weak. Whatever aura the Mysterios gave off sapped him, feeding on his reactor energy, much as it shriveled the fish and crustaceans that drifted still and dead behind him, like the trail of the old fireworms of myth. No, it was not only that. It was the weight of history. Vishani, High Cryptek of the Amunos, had inscribed this message 65 million years ago, before she burned in the furnaces of biotransference. Here stood a relic of the Necrontyr, a thing fashioned by those hands of flesh they'd so despised, and would give anything to reclaim. Even the fireworms, he had forgotten them, an old folk tale of an abandoned planet, a memory stolen from him by the avarice and deceit of the Catan, now returned. He felt a substance leaking from his oculars, and for a bare instant thought he was weeping. Then he realized it was also coming from his olfactory transducers and mouth. Reactor bile. Coolant fluid. He'd received no notices or alerts, but the Mysterios was killing him. Trazin let it go, fell to his knees as he watched it rise before the doors like a floating lantern. Another flash of memory. Orange prayer lanterns floating above the dunes, each painted with a message begging the solar gods of the Necrontyr to keep the illness away during the new year. Hands on his shoulders. His mother? His father? The Mysterios, spinning madly, shifting dimensions and angles, locked. An icosahedron. 20 faces, 12 vertices, smooth as blackstone, shining hot, projecting geometric mandalas that, when Trazin looked at them, seemed to contain great gulfs of space. Things long past, things meant to be, places distant and destroyed. The tomb doors ground open, tortuously, disturbing eons of sediment and sending cracks along the walls of the chamber as they retreated into hidden cavities. Through the widening crack rippled the colourless pool of a deactivated portal, a mirror in the cosmos. Walk into it, and one would simply walk out the same surface. It needed directions, to know where to go. Trazyn opened his mouth, calling up an engram of the arithmantic incantation that would activate the Mysterios. In his neural matrices, he saw Orokin intoning the words, his hands sinuously twisting into occult gestures whose significance escaped Trazyn. He could, however, match the gestures exactly, while playing Orokin's recorded incantation from his own metal throat. He said the first word, and faltered. For the tomb's antechamber had begun to tremble. Whatever power the Mysterios radiated must, he reasoned, have triggered a seismic shift, or else the great doors, long the foundation upon which trillions of tons of seafloor had rested, had triggered an undersea avalanche with their movement. No, he realized. It was coming from behind him. Trazyn turned and saw the light illuminating the entrance tunnel. It was nearly as bright as that leaking from the Eternity Gate. And then a meteor burst through it, smashing aside the defensive vanguard with their shields raised against the glare. It scattered them as easily as a frustrated hand swept pieces off a Senate board. They fell away. The proud turquoise livery on their chest plates burned black, an electric fire clawing out of their oculars and mouths. The incandescent meteor slammed into the floor of the chamber, silt blown sideways where it landed, and sponges tumbling away so the black stone floor lay clean around it. The figure crouched, feet braced, hands planting a staff on the abyssal floor, one baleful eye boring straight at Trazyn. Trazyn swore, a curse from old Necrontyr so foul that anyone writing it would have their hands struck off. "Astromancer," he said, nodding a greeting. Even a league away, he knew that Orokin could see and hear him. He called up his empathic obliterator. "Ashkot, please exterminate this insect. The scorpion may sting, but he is at least alone." But then Trazyn saw the source of the shaking. It was not the door, or the Mysterios, or Orokin's empowered form. It was thousands upon thousands of metal feet. Behind Orokin, the tunnel began to crumble and vent silt. Oculars glowed in its cloudy depths, and metal bodies erupted from the entrance, as if a whole burrow of sand ants had risen to defend their queen. Warriors marched out, led by cryptex wielding staves of arcane power. Scorpec destroyers scuttled out through the roof of the tunnel and swarmed up the chamber walls. Wraiths swam in the ghostly light of the bioluminescent ecosystem, their undulating forms quick and agile, while Trazyn's own bipedal troops slowly tracked their targets, impeded by the cold water, waiting for their directive. When the Silent King had abandoned the Necrons, he destroyed the command protocols that he'd used to dictate his orders. Yet some remained as instinct, hardwired into systems that were built to obey. Provided they were functioning properly, no Necron of vassal rank could fire on one of its own kind, not without a direct override from their lord. Before the Silent King's departure, the protocol had put a stop to eons of blood feud and internecine warfare. It had allowed the Infinite Empire's expansion, forming a stable bedrock that had let them murder the star gods and banish the old ones. If one Necron slew another, it must be by direct order, and the party responsible would be held to account, explaining why they had turned on their own kind.
"By the order of Overlord Trazyn of Solemnes," he said. "Fire! Fire! Fire!"
Chapter 5. If the enemy surrounds you, there are only two tactical options. The first is to break out of the encirclement and retreat, which, if successful, will preserve your army but ensure the chroniclers remember you as a defeated fool. The second is to fight to the death, in which case you will destroy your army, but the histories will laud you as a slain hero. Given these two options, I consider encirclement generally inadvisable. Nemesor Zandrek, The Logic of Battle. Disassembling beams tore through the abyssal dark, atomizing fish and luminescent jellies, eating away at Sortek warriors that, implacable and uncomplaining, carried on pushing through the water as they ceased to exist. The cold water dragged on metal limbs and traversing weapons, giving the combat a sense of deliberation, like sparring partners moving at three-quarter speed to learn a new fighting stance. It was as if, Orokin thought, he were watching the battle with his chronosense dialed slightly back, if not for the beams. They leapt through the water as fast as ever. From above, Orokin saw a quartet of synaptic disintegrator beams lance into a knot of Skorpek destroyers that were advancing across the ceiling. One quivered and fell, sinking towards the raging combat below. Orokin sensed danger and locked the threat down, an immortal hiding in the kelp, bright light already splashing from his Gauss blaster. Orokin ran time back a second, then knitted his fingers to summon the prism of Zycanthus, scattering the beam into harmless bands of light. Then he leapt, his insubstantial form immune to the impeding water. The dissonance between slow-moving troops and fast-moving beams had made the cavern a killing ground. Warriors and immortals dropped, whole ranks snuffed out by the relentless Gauss fire. This watery battlefield also multiplied the effectiveness of Tesla carbines. Their directed electrical strikes raged like storms through the Sortek ranks, turning them from a support weapon to a heavy cannon with a lingering blast radius. Orokin hit the immortal even before the trigger on its Gauss blaster reset for a second shot, plunged a shining hand into his ropey entrail cables, found the spine and yanked it out through his front, swung the Staff of Tomorrow around, scything down kelp, and cleanly decapitated a second immortal. The one with a Tesla carbine turned on him, electrode chamber cycling for a shot. Orokin spoke an equation and overloaded the weapon, finishing the troublesome soldier with an electricity storm that fused his joints and left him a blackened statue, falling stiff into the silt. He was so powerful. All the energy in the galaxy channeling directly into his system. The light that bent around black holes, the particles that raced across time and space from the furnace of creation. The entire flow of cosmic energy was focused here, focused on him. There was so much, he found himself frustrated that he couldn't contain it all, like a tomb robber who had broken open a chamber of treasures and could only carry away what fitted in their small bag. The wealth of energy he had was immense, but there was more he could tap into, so much more. Orokin reached out a clawed hand and twisted. Halfway across the chamber, the Nahailak Lychguard broke ranks and laid into her fellows, carving deep wounds in their unprotected backs. With a single word, he crushed the skull of a deathmark in the chamber above. The Skorpek destroyers on the ceiling had finally reached the sniper team, and he saw their arachnid legs rear back before spearing two of the deathmarks. Unable, due to the chamber's unique geology, to flee to their hyperspace oubliette, the marksmen died, waving their long disintegrators in a pathetic parody of self-defense. Orokin might have scried into the Skorpeks to relish the moment, but he had greater things to attend to, and even empowered, he feared the corrupted programming of the destroyers might infect him. Besides, he could see the gate. The tomb entrance. It had not been activated, and he surged through the water to ensure that he would be the one to open it. One did not have to be a military being to know that this battle was going poorly. Trazin's expedition had numbered around 500, his usual corps of Lychguard and Immortals, the acquisition phalanx he took on many hard-to-crack worlds, augmented with warriors and deathmarks.
"Ashcott!"
signalled Trazin, trying to find the royal warden in the melee. Trazin had climbed atop a spur of coral to get a better view of the enormous cavern.
"Are things as bad as they look?" "Very precarious, Lord," Ashcott responded. "We are facing at least 4 times our number. The enemy continues to emerge. We made a great butchery of them.
A pause. Trazyn finally located his royal warden, focused in with his oculars, and watched him grab a cryptek by the top of its ribcage and slam his hyperphase blade up through the vulnerable space between ribs and spine. The cryptek's reactor detonated with a gush of bile, splaying his ribs outward.
Apologies for the interruption, my lord. We made a great butchery of them at range, but they have disordered our firing lines. We are outnumbered. They are taking the ceiling and upper galleries and will soon be behind us.
Trazyn looked up and saw the destroyers flooding the ceiling, clambering and skittering through the dark like pale crabs. Yes, Ashkut was right. They were about to be surrounded and cut off. His oculars detected a burst of solar energy on the floor of the cavern, and Trazyn turned to see the water shimmering with heat waves and steam bubbles. A Sortek plasmancer, his tendril-like legs propelling him through the water like a squid, had risen with his arms spread and summoned a corona of solar heat. Gathering energy that lit even the cavern's shadowy vaults, he bombarded the Lich Guard below with balls of pure radiation. To Trazyn's left, the last of his warriors fell, trodden into the silt by the advancing enemies. Weak hands still clutching at the legs of their killers, trying to at least slow the progress of the foe. Faithful to the end, not knowing or not understanding that unlike their other deaths, there would be no resurrection from this one, no phasing into the belly of a tomb ship to be rebuilt. Here, below Serenade, dead was dead. It was time, Trazyn decided. He reached into his dimensional pocket, selected a Tesseract labyrinth, and pressed the key. Volmak Kazar, datasmith second class in the sacred Legio Cybernetica, machine god's blessed maintenance be upon it, was having difficulty calibrating their surroundings. Last they had known, Kazar and their complement of Castellan robots had been wading through Drakari raiders in the mountains of Rubric 7, their breathing apparatus modified into a reusable oxygen system to deal with the massive altitude. Yet now, if their environmental scanners did not lie, they were underwater. A great depth underwater, if the pressure gauges read correctly. And the live Eldari were gone. In their place were metal men, constructs cursed by the machine god, blasphemous things, forged, not made, that mocked the purity of the human form that still, despite their mechadendrites and databanks, lay within Volmak Kazar. With a trill of fear, their cybernetic brain brought up shadowy legends of the Men of Iron, the abominable intelligence said to have nearly brought mankind to ruin. There were troops next to them, fighting the invaders, green beams lashing out like whips that disassembled the enemy where they struck them. They were about to turn their head, but a strong urge prevented it, and the momentary warning of a system compromise winked out. Their cybernetic brain informed them that they had no need to see these allies, but they were to thank the machine god that these allies were fighting on their side. So they did.
Castellan compliment,
the tech priest signalled in Mechanicus Beinharic cant. 9 hulking robots stood straighter, dome heads turning towards Kazar for orders. Power fists crackled, and weapons chambered in anticipation, merely at the tone of Kazar's logic speech.
Destroy the abominations.
9 big shoulders swung around and advanced, weapons acquiring targets. There were so many, it took no time at all, despite the slowness of the water. Phosphor blasters coughed, barrels streaming steam bubbles as they launched burning spheres of chemical fire towards the crawling horde. Streams of white starbursts slapped into the advancing infantry, stuck to their metal bodies, the infernal chemical burning underwater and melting metal skin until the foul unmetal bubbled off, rehardening in the cold water so the abyssal floor was littered with steel pellets. The Castellans, Kazar noticed on their data slate, were keeping up an exceptional rate of fire. With water this cold, the phosphor blasters had no risk of overheating. Number 7, though, was dumbly firing its incendiary combustor into the water, despite the fact that instead of flames, a coiling trail of promethium spread from the weapon's muzzle. Kazar disabled the weapon and ordered it to enter close combat. Number 7 stepped forward and swung its power fist, crushing 2 of the blasphemous monstrosities. To their left, Kazar saw an Onager dune crawler scuttle forward, a barrage of rockets whooshing out from its Icarus array and detonating amidst the foe, throwing metal body parts that fizzled as they sank. Kazar drew their gamma pistol and blasted into the onrushing horde, their shoulder vox broadcasting the litany of data corroboration. It was an honor, Kazar thought, to serve the machine god. Kadera Toll was loving this. She'd begun to tire of the high-altitude combat against the Emperor's little machine drones. True enough that their pain at seeing their clumsy experiments rent and destroyed provided a certain distraction, but that juice was far too easy to squeeze. And studying their poor attempts to fuse flesh and machine did little to further her own surgical endeavours. After all, one did not rise in the homunculi order by mimicking the crude fleshworks of the dead Emperor's little machine men. But this she enjoyed. Her experiments, fitted with anti-grav engines that bulged beneath their purpling skin, had always been used to swimming through air. And the high altitude of the rubric spine range had persuaded her to fit them with pressurized masks. The seals were not perfect, of course, for what was the fun if they did not choke a bit on the thin air? Or the water, now, as the case might be. She herself was elated to finally use the gills she'd vat-grown for herself 2 centuries back. Their lack of use had become the subject of a few sharp jests at a party she'd thrown. Everyone had quite a laugh at her expense. Speaking of which, her Kronos reached the bladed things on the ceiling, lashing out with the bristled tendrils that she'd flesh-worked from its arms, wrapping the cleaver-armed Necron in a revolting embrace. She watched as the bristles of needle-thin spikes in the tendrils ignited, their power fields spiking the metal monstrosity in 300 different places and injecting acid directly into its system. Both Kronos' flesh construct and bladed berserker shivered together, like lovers consummating a night of passion, and she knew the Kronos was in as much pain, if not more, than its victim. "Teaches you to make fun of my gills, Xantha," she thought, with a lopsided grin, as the being that was once her old drinking companion let go of the victim and reached for another. One of his tendrils had fallen victim to a Necron blade and drifted past, still wriggling around the ailing destroyer. Toll kicked her way to the still form and looked into its eyes, supping on the anger that burned there. She flicked through her implant toolkit and drew out a necrodermis needle. Fortunate she had one, for they were uncommon, and plunged the spike into the Necron's primary fluid secretor. The reactor bile filling the crystal vial was such a lovely shade of yellow. Extremely rare, this substance. Terribly toxic. Unsubtle, true, but effective in the extreme. And you know the Necrons. It was so bothersome to harvest it before they phased. A pure sample was hard to come by. But these metal ruffians didn't seem to be phasing at all. In fact, she got a closer look at this destroyer than she'd ever had before, and felt a certain kinship. Clearly this being had once been one of its standardized kin, yet the genius of creation had come upon it, and, like her, it had decided to make itself a work of violent art. Each bladed limb, each protruding pneumatic chest spear and bristling weapon had been fused to its frame. Toll patted its dead cheek with her grafted third arm and pushed off him with the extended spine tail that made her move so gracefully in the water. Another destroyer floated past her, and she looked up. More constructs were laying into the bladed monsters, flagella-like tentacles lashing and wrapping. Bladed spider limbs of the Necron body artisans meeting the whips and flesh hooks of her own work. Dear friends, she thought, mentally greeting the rest of her party guests, meet your ancient and feared foe, the Necrons. Do try not to laugh. Orokin speared his staff through a tracked construct. Nothing so much as a brain-dead corpse wired into a small tank, its skin sallow and pumped with embalming fluid. Even in his light form, one that only existed partially in the physical plane, he did not want to touch it. Trazyn. Only Trazyn would be perverse enough to collect such creatures. Orokin wheeled and dashed under the swiping arm of a big construct, one of the 9 that had made such a mess of his warriors, and slashed one of its legs through as he passed. It toppled forward, severed limb buzzing with white electrical shorts as the idiot machine kept moving its legs as if it were upright, its empty weapon firing into the sponges. A searing beam stitched across his left arm, and he whirled, seeing one of the machine cultists coming at him with a pistol. Orokin's enhanced senses detected the presence of mind shackle scarabs in the tech priest system, and drew the sign of thought in the air. The cultist's hand shook as their finger tried to tighten on the trigger, and could not.
"You wish to worship machines?"
snarled Orokin.
"On your knees."
The tech priest dropped to their knees, then prostrated themselves in the hazily glowing silt, surrounded by shredded sponge. The priest's right hand, twisting at an unnatural angle, held the beam pistol to the back of their own head. Orokin did not wait to see the pistol go off. He passed more abominations, spindly-legged machine men with sucking gas masks suited to their faces, a bipedal stilt-walker spitting heavy laser fire. He sent an interstitial message for his plasmancer to deal with it. Orokin could already feel the planetary alignment passing, his power weakening. The beam pistol had burned off a measure of his cosmic energy, and when he opened his ports to channel from the great lines of the zodiac, he found the particles moving sluggishly now through the lines of space-time. That meant there was little time to activate the Eternity Gate. A spider tank stalked by, thudding lazy hard rounds out of its twin cannons, and Orokin weaved by it, bolt-dashing between the moving legs. To his right, a warrior in slick-bladed armor and a rebreather face mask fired some kind of Eldari pistol, and he uttered Haki's reversal, sending the storm of splinters back into the stunned raider so his blood misted the water. Then a hulking bodyguard, a royal warden if he was not wrong, stepped into his path. Orokin had not time to deal with him properly, so he cast a quick combat algorithm to predict the vassal's movements. He slid, skidding feet first through the silt and under the warden's first high blow. As he passed, he swept high, severing the vassal's spine. It would not kill him. Orokin had not the time for finishing blows, but the guard would not interfere. A last dash, sliding through the slippery kelp grove, pausing only to drop a chronomantic hex field to slow anyone pursuing him. The Mysterios hung, suspended, brighter now, transmuted, singing, and he could hear her in that song, urging him forward. "You are so close, Orokin. See my name on this door? You solved the riddle, not him. Do not let this thief steal your glory. Only you will understand what you shall find here. No being is my equal. None but you." Orokin stood beneath the arithmetic lodestone of the Mysterios, the piece that gave him the unknown variable in the equation. Without that variable, given by the Mysterios and different each second, the algorithm would not be complete. Trazyn could have watched him recite the algorithm 1,000 times, probably had, and it would not have mattered. And though the language was strange to him, it somehow imprinted the impossible number directly into his engrams, the last piece of the puzzle. He spoke the cryptographic algorithm. The Mysterios slammed inward, imploding, folding and shifting, each of its 20 faces stretching deep into the core until every angle stood out in a point, a jagged starburst of equilateral triangle faces. The mirror surface of the portal shimmered and shifted, a billowing green in the center that spread to encompass the gateway. Orokin could see the chamber beyond, saw ranks upon ranks of figures silhouetted in the indistinct haze of the portal, and, for a moment, Orokin feared trickery, that Trazyn had infiltrated the tomb before him and installed an army there. But as he stepped forward, he saw that the figures were stone, worn with the long eons. Their backs were turned to him, as if they stood at attention for the Pharaon who presumably lay beyond, at the center of the tomb. The water seemed to draw him towards the portal, as it rushed through to fill the tomb. It happened slowly, a light pull rather than a torrent. Orokin stepped forward, whispering thanks to the constellations and whatever nameless god or power put them into motion. And then the Obliterator hit him from behind. Orokin stepped back to the past, found his way blocked by Trazyn's cursed cloak. No past could exist, it seemed, where he was not struck. Instead, Orokin went back as far as he could, a bare half-second, twisting his head so the staff struck a glancing blow rather than scattering the whirl of protons that formed his cranium. He staggered, recovered, wheeled on Trazyn with his staff held in a high guard.
"My heartiest thanks, Orikan," Trazyn said. "Quite chivalrous to hold the door open like that."
Then Trazyn turned and dashed for the rippling dimensional gate. Orokin threw his staff like a trident, pinning the Lord's cloak to the sediment. And then he was on him, empowered hands tearing at Trazyn's abdominal cabling, scratching furrows down his death mask, hammering dents in his ribs.
"Bent-backed fool! Arrogant conniver! I'll rip your head from that hold, you degenerate!"
As he slammed his fists into Trazyn, he could see them flickering. Incandescent one blow, cold metal the next. The tide of energy had ebbed, the constellations sliding on their uncaring path where one alignment was as good as another.
"Damn!"
Orokin shrieked, clawing his way towards the dimming portal. Something impeded him, and he knew Trazyn had locked hands around his leg. Only a few moments left. He kicked Trazyn's death mask, saw it crack, kicked again and shattered away a piece of Necroderma's skull plate, exposing bare circuits. Behind them, Orokin heard the sounds of battle, the howl of Gaussfire already echoing through the turbid waters of the cavern, reach a crescendo. His perception suite reasserting itself in fits as the empowering energy drained, warned of incoming threats. That's when he saw them, the Triarch Praetorians. They surged out of the entrance tunnel in an arrowhead phalanx, smashing through Sortek and Nikhailak alike, driving a wedge into the Sortek rear, scything down the enmeshed forces with their rods of covenant. As he watched, the formation split, driving to either side to form a cordon between Sortek and Nikhailak. One beat a Cryptek aside with the flat of his void blade, and raised a particle caster with the other hand, driving a shot directly into the vision slit of the crab-like Mechanicus tank, so the vehicle staggered and heeled over. And at their front was Executioner Phileas, one hand raised high and projecting the three-eyed glyph of the awakened council. If Orokin had any doubt, the message broadcast banished it. "This is an override command. All troops of the Empire will cease combat by order of the Council. This is an override command. Put up your weapons. The penalty for disobedience is death." Orokin broke Trazyn's weak grip and ran, towards the stone silhouettes in the crypt beyond, towards the voice that bade him come, towards the fading shimmer of the portal. He stretched out his hands at the fading image. They struck bare rock. The stars were no longer right, and the portal was dead.